Finished letter that is shared with the CEO opens a conversation that I believe never really happens, almost never happens in any other way. A full assessment of where the organization's human capital actually stands with a conclusion behind every section. The conversation is different from a talent update. The CEO engages with conclusions directly. The CHRO who brings the letter is positioned as a diagnostic partner. The one who brings the deck is positioned as a reporter. The letter earns the conversation. The conversation earns the influence. Hey there, senior leader, and welcome to the Talent Sherpa podcast, where senior leaders come to rethink how human capital really works. I'm your host, Jackson Lynch, and today we're going to run a thought experiment I think you're going to find useful. Warren Buffett writes a letter to Berkshire Hathaway shareholders every year. He's done it for decades. He doesn't have to. He does it because writing forces a different quality of thinking. When you put a diagnosis on paper with your name on it, you're committing to it in a way that a slide deck never really demands. You can hedge in a conversation. A letter doesn't let you do that. So the thought experiment is this. What would it look like if the CHRO wrote the equivalent letter to a CEO every year? A letter on the state of human capital, bench strength, succession risk, capability gaps the strategy depends on, what was promised last year and what was actually built. And the one thing that you have the most difficulty putting on paper. That letter doesn't exist in most organizations right now. And I think the absence of it tells us something that's worth sitting with. Now, before we get started, let me ask you for a quick favor. If you find value in these conversations, please take a minute, like, subscribe, or follow the Talent Sherpa podcast wherever you get your shows. It helps more senior leaders find the show, and it allows us to keep doing this work for the larger HR community. And this week, I want to talk to you just briefly about the Talent Sherpa Substack. It's a weekly publication on human capital strategy for all senior leaders who want to think more clearly about how talent drives business outcomes. If you want more of what you hear on this show delivered in your inbox every week, you can subscribe at talentsherpa.substack.com. The first issues are free, so come on in and take a look. All right, let's dive into this. Here's what the CHRO reporting calendar looks like in most well-run organizations. There's a monthly talent update. We share turnover numbers and open recs and engagement scores from the last survey. Maybe even a survey of what we're doing and a summary of the development initiative that's currently running. The CHRO presents it, the leadership team listens, the CFO asks a couple of questions about costs, the CEO nods, and the conversation then moves quickly into whatever's impacting the P&L. Then there's the quarterly talent review, succession charts, performance ratings, pipeline health across functions and levels, more data, more slides. Taken together, those reviews produce a substantial volume of information about what's happening inside the talent system. What they almost never produce is a point of view. A point of view says, here's where we're strong, here's where we carry risk, here's what I believe is happening in the organization's talent system, why it's happening, and what it's going to cost us if we don't do something about it. A point of view concludes, it commits, it doesn't just describe. Now, I've sat in a ton of leadership meetings across a lot of different organizations. The CHRO who can walk into a room and deliver a precise diagnosed assessment of the organization's human capital position with a recommendation attached and a name behind it is genuinely uncommon. Now, the data is almost always there. The analysis is often there. What's missing, though, is the discipline of converting that analysis into a conclusion and then standing behind it. The annual talent letter is the exercise that forces that discipline. Now, there are three structural traps that I think keep CHROs from developing a genuine point of view on their organization's talent position. And I want to name each of those specifically because they all feel like the right move until you examine what they actually produce. The first trap is treating data as diagnosis. The CHRO has the metrics. We've invested so much in that over the last few years. We know turnover is 14%. We have 3 pivotal succession roles with no ready candidate. We have engagement scores that are down 6 points in the business unit that carries 40% of the revenue plan. The data is accurate and the data is not a diagnosis. A diagnosis says what's happening, why it's happening, and what the organization should do about it. When the CHRO brings metrics without the diagnosis attached, the CEO receives a description of a problem that they have to then interpret for themselves. Most CEOs file that under HR topics and move on. They would engage, by the way, if the CHRO gave them something specific enough to act on. The framing hasn't really given them that. So data without a view on what it means is a weather report. It describes conditions, and it leaves the conclusion to someone else. Now, the second trap is writing reports when the business needs assessments. A report describes what happens. An assessment concludes what it means. So most CHRO deliverables are actually reports. Technically, they are very thorough. They are organizationally inert. They surface engagement patterns without committing to a view on what those patterns actually mean for the execution of what's important over the next 12 months. They describe the succession charts without concluding anything about the real succession risk that the organization is carrying. The discipline of writing the annual talent letter forces a shift. You cannot write the succession pipeline is healthy and then defend that claim across 4 pages of honest analysis. The letter finds the gap between the phrase and the reality. And the third trap is circling the hard thing without actually landing on it. We've all done this. Every CHRO I've worked with has at least one thing they know about their organization's talent position that they haven't actually committed to in writing. A succession situation that's more fragile than the charts might suggest, a leadership dynamic that is quietly costing the business, a capability gap that the strategy depends upon closing that is not, in all honesty, being closed. In conversation, those things are easy to circle. There are some dynamics we're watching. The pipeline isn't quite where we'd like it to be. It doesn't work in a letter. The letter demands more than that. It requires a sentence, a committed sentence with a verb and a noun and a consequence attached. The inability to write that sentence is itself diagnostic. The CHRO often knows more than they've committed to. The work still ahead is forming a view and then putting a name behind it. So here's what changes when you treat the annual talent letter as a forcing function and not as a deliverable. The value is in what the writing requires of the person producing it. It is, in fact, why I've gotten to be such a better HR leader from doing these podcasts and writing my Substack. The finished document is the output, but the discipline required to produce it is where the clarity actually comes from. Warren Buffett writes this letter because committing to a diagnosis in full sentences with his name on it requires that the diagnosis be finished. Slides let you leave things unresolved. A letter commits you to a finished diagnosis. The CHRO equivalent covers 4 things. First, bench strength at pivotal roles. The letter asks for a genuine judgment on who belongs in critical roles and who carries risk. Are the right people in the right places? For the roles where the answer is uncertain, what is the honest assessment of the risk? And what is the realistic path to addressing it in the next 12 months? Second, the succession risk, named very specifically. Which 3 roles carry the most enterprise exposure if the current incumbent exits? What is the actual state of the pipeline behind them, beyond what the succession chart shows? Third is the capability gap the strategy depends on. The organization has committed to a growth plan, a transformation, an integration, a new market entry. Each of these commitments has a talent dependency. The letter names what those dependencies are and whether the organization has a realistic plan to meet them. And fourth, what was promised versus what was built. Last year's talent plan made commitments. The letter compares those commitments to what actually happened and explains the variance. That section alone requires a quality of self-assessment that most talent reviews never ever approach. The CHRO, though, who can write across all 4 of those dimensions and stand behind every line is operating at a different altitude than the one who stalls out in metric summaries. The letter is an altitude test. So how do you actually write this letter? Let me share a few plays. Play number 1. Write the private version first. Don't share it with anyone. Before the letter is a CEO deliverable, Write it to yourself. Write it to know whether you actually have a point of view. No audience, no presentation, just you, the 4 dimensions, and a blank page. If you can produce 4 pages that hold under scrutiny, you have a view. If you stall after 2 paragraphs of data summaries, you have a discovery process ahead of you. That's okay. Either outcome is valuable information. The private letter finds the gap between the CHRO you believe yourself to be and the diagnosis that you can actually deliver. Play number 2. Try to anchor every section to a business outcome. The annual talent letter is a business assessment written through a talent lens. Every section needs a direct line to the business outcome the organization is trying to either achieve or protect. Bench strength connects to executional reliability on the growth commitments. Succession risk might connect to a business continuity exposure in the roles that matter most. Capability gaps connect to execution risk on specific strategic bets. The talent assessment and the business assessment are the same assessment. The letter makes that explicit in every single section, not just at the summary level. And then play number 3 is write the sentence you'd have trouble putting on paper. You know the one I'm talking about. Every CHRO has one. It's the thing they know with confidence but haven't committed to in writing. Maybe haven't even shared verbally. The leadership dynamic that is leaking value. The succession situation that looks better on paper than it actually is. The investment that has been funded but is not producing results. Find that sentence and write it. And if you can write it and stand behind it, it belongs in the letter and a conversation with the CEO. If you can't write it yet, that's okay. The diagnosis is still in progress, and the letter isn't ready. That sentence, by the way, is the test. And then play number 4, use the letter as a calibration conversation. A finished letter that is shared with the CEO opens a conversation that I believe never really happens, almost never happens in any other way. A full assessment of where the organization's human capital actually stands with a conclusion behind every section. The conversation is different from a talent update. The CEO engages with conclusions directly. The CHRO who brings the letter is positioned as a diagnostic partner. The one who brings the deck is positioned as a reporter. The letter earns the conversation. The conversation earns the influence. And one more thing before we close. The first time you write this letter privately, you will finish it, read it back, and find at least 2 things you should have told the CEO 3 months ago. That's the exercise. It's okay. That means it's working exactly as designed. And if there's one thing I want you to carry away from this episode, it's this. The CHRO who can write the annual talent letter and stand behind every line is already operating at a different altitude. And that sentence that you'd have trouble putting on paper is precisely where the letter should start. So thank you for spending time with me today. And I appreciate you being a part of this community of senior leaders who want to rethink how human capital really works. Shout out this week to Marcus from Houston, Texas, my hometown, at least for now. And I want to say thank you for listening, whether you are listening in from Atlanta, Georgia, or Sydney, Australia. This community keeps growing internationally, and that is because of you. Now, if you're thinking about how to apply this in your own situation, let me point you to a couple of resources. If role clarity is where you want to start, and it probably should be, check out getpropulsion.ai. They have AI teammates that enable your leadership to focus on the work that actually drives business outcomes. And if you're a first-time CHRO and you're preparing to step into the role perhaps in the next 6 to 12 months, I'd love to work with you. We build practical tools to help you make an impact from day one at various levels of expense. You can find everything over at mytalentsherpa.com and the best-selling talentsherpa.substack.com. So until next time, keep raising the bar. Keep writing the assessment you'd rather not put on paper. And keep on climbing.